2 months of a child's hard work. One morning walk, white lilies trembling in his hands. He was ready to give happiness but had no idea that this day would change everything. Before we start, don't forget to like and subscribe. It takes just a second for you but means the world to me. Jake always knew that his mom was the most important person in his life. She worked 12-hour shifts at the cafe, coming home late, exhausted, but every night she still found the strength to kneel beside him, run her fingers through his hair and whisper, "Good night, my boy." They didn't have expensive things or a big house. Their home was small, their kitchen barely had room for two, but none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was that his mom was always there. She rarely had time to rest. If she ever had a free hour, she spent it with him, reading bedtime stories or telling him about her childhood. But even then, he could see the fatigue in her eyes. She never complained about how hard things were. But Jake noticed. He saw how her shoulders dropped slightly when she opened envelopes with overdue bills, how her fingers trembled as she counted the last few bills before payday. And one day, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. It happened when she was talking to their neighbor, Mrs. Anderson. "Ellie, you should at least celebrate this year," Mrs. Anderson said. "Oh, come on," his mom answered with a small chuckle. "What's there to celebrate? The only thing that matters is that I have Jake." She said it so casually, like her birthday was nothing special. But something inside Jake clenched. It was then that he realized. He had never seen his mom celebrate her birthday.
No cake. No candles.
No laughter from friends filling the house. And for the first time he asked himself, has she ever received a gift? The answer was obvious. Never. And that was unfair. This year things would be different. That night, lying in bed, he thought for a long time. What could he give her? A book? A scarf? But none of it felt right. Then a memory came to him. A few weeks ago, they had been walking home from her shift at the cafe. Passing by a flower shop, she suddenly slowed down. Behind the glass display, standing among dozens of colorful bouquets, were white lilies. For a few seconds she just looked at them. "They're beautiful," she whispered, almost to herself. And then, as if shaking off a thought, she smiled faintly and kept walking. Jake never forgot the things that mattered. White lilies. That was it. The problem was he had no money. That night he searched through every drawer, checked every pocket, hoping to find something. By the time he was done, he had only a handful of coins and a couple of crumpled bills. Not even enough for a single petal. But he wasn't going to give up. The next morning he set out to find work. His first stop was Mrs. Anderson. She sometimes asked him to take out her trash. "Of course, Jake," she said, handing him a few coins. He thanked her and ran to find more jobs. He helped old Mrs. Rose carry her groceries home. She smiled and slipped a few bills into his palm. That evening, he spread the money on his bed and counted. Still not enough. The next day he kept looking. He stopped by the grocery store and asked if they needed help stacking shelves. "Sorry, kid," the owner said. "We don't have any extra money to spare." He tried the cafe where his mom worked, but even there they turned him down. "You're too young to work, Jake," one of the waitresses said, patting his shoulder. He hated those words. Days passed. He worked as much as he could. Washing dishes, sweeping sidewalks, raking leaves. Every night, he laid out his earnings, hoping that by some miracle they would multiply. But time was running out. He needed something bigger. One evening, he overheard two men talking outside a store. "I heard old man Tom is looking for a helper. His garden's a mess." That was his chance. Tom lived on the edge of town in a small house with a large, overgrown garden. When Jake showed up at his doorstep, the man eyed him for a long time, as if trying to figure out if he was serious. "Gardening is hard work, kid," he finally said. "Think you can handle it?" "Yes, sir. We'll see about that." The garden was a disaster. Tall weeds, broken branches, dry leaves covering every inch of soil. Tom handed him a shovel. Jake gripped it tightly. His hands were small, his arms weren't strong, but he refused to give up. He dug. The earth was dry and stubborn, the weeds clung to his fingers, His back started aching after the first hour, but he kept going. He worked until his legs shook from exhaustion. By the time the sun started setting, Tom nodded approvingly. "You did good, kid," he said, handing him a few bills. "Come back tomorrow." Jake clenched the money in his fist. This was his first real step. For the next 2 months he returned to that garden. Every day. He worked until his hands ached and his muscles burned. His mom didn't know. Whenever she asked why he was so tired, he just smiled. "It's a surprise." Weeks passed. His hands toughened. His body adjusted to the labor. He never once complained. And then, finally, he counted his money. It was enough. Enough for an entire bouquet. Jake lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. A deep, satisfied exhaustion settled over him. He had done it. In the morning, he would get up early, go to the flower shop, and pick the most beautiful white lilies. He could already picture her face. How she'd take the bouquet, press it to her chest, and smile at him the way only she could. That image stayed with him as he closed his eyes. Tomorrow all his hard work would pay off. Jake woke up before sunrise. The room was still dark, but his heart was already racing with excitement. Today was the day he had been waiting for, the day he had worked so hard for. He quickly threw on his clothes, grabbed the neatly folded bills he had saved, and slipped them into his pocket. The morning air was crisp and fresh, carrying the scent of damp earth. The sky was still a deep shade of blue, but on the horizon, the first traces of pink and gold were beginning to appear.
Jake walked fast.
No, he almost ran. His hands were clenched in his pockets, fingers gripping the money as if he were afraid it would disappear. His mind replayed the moment over and over again. Walking into the flower shop, buying the lilies, coming home, seeing his mom's face light up with surprise. This would be the best birthday she had ever had. The flower shop wasn't open yet when he arrived. He stood in front of the glass door, shifting from foot to foot. The streets were quiet, the city just beginning to wake up. After a few minutes he saw the shop's lights flicker on. A woman appeared inside, the same florist who was always there in the mornings. She caught sight of him standing outside and raised an eyebrow as she unlocked the door. "You're up early, kid." Jake smiled, still breathless from his walk. "I want to buy white lilies." She gave him a curious look but didn't ask any questions. Instead, she walked to a tall glass case, pulled out a bouquet, and carefully wrapped it in clear paper. The flowers were even more beautiful up close. Their white petals looked soft, delicate, perfect. Jake reached into his pocket, pulled out the crumpled bills and handed them to her. "They're for someone special?" she asked as she counted the money. "Yeah," he said proudly. "It's a gift from my mom." The woman smiled, handing him the bouquet. "I'm sure she'll love them." Jake held the flowers tightly, feeling a wave of pride wash over him. He had done it. He had worked for this moment and now it was real. All that was left was to go home and give them to her. His walk back was even faster. The cold wind brushed against his cheeks, but he barely noticed. His heart was too full of excitement, of joy, of anticipation. The bouquet was clutched tightly in his hands. He could already see the moment happening, could hear his mom's surprised laughter, could imagine the warmth in her eyes. He ran up the front steps of the house, flung the door open and called out, "Happy birthday, Mom." Silence. Jake froze, waiting for her voice to answer, waiting for the sound of her footsteps. But the house was still. Maybe she was still asleep? That thought made him grin. She was always up before him, but today she could sleep in. Still holding the bouquet, he stepped inside. "Mom?" No answer. A strange feeling settled in his stomach. Something felt wrong. He moved further into the house, glancing toward the kitchen. The lights were off. Her usual morning cup of tea wasn't on the table. His fingers tightened around the bouquet. He took a step toward the staircase. And then, his breath caught in his throat. At the bottom of the stairs, lying motionless on the floor, his mom. The bouquet slipped from his hands. White petals scattered across the wooden floor. "Mom!" His voice cracked as he ran forward, dropping to his knees beside her. Her body was still. One arm was stretched out, fingers barely curled, as if she had been reaching for something. Jake's hand shook as he grabbed her shoulder, gently shaking her. "Mom, wake up. Please." Nothing. A choked sob rose in his throat. He shook her again, harder this time. "Mom, please. Just open your eyes." She didn't move. No. 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 This wasn't happening. She was fine yesterday. They had dinner together. They had laughed. She was fine. His breaths came faster, panic flooding his chest.
No.
"Mom, please." His vision blurred. He couldn't think. Couldn't breathe. Somewhere in the haze, his hand found his pocket. His fingers trembled as he pulled out his phone. He didn't even know how he dialed. All he could hear was his own broken voice. "Help. Please. My mom. She won't wake up." The words came out wrong, messy, gasping between shallow breaths. The person on the other end was talking, asking questions, but he couldn't process anything. "Just hurry. Please." Minutes stretched into eternity. And then sirens. Bright flashing lights. Voices. Hands pulling him away as people in uniforms rushed past him. Jake stood frozen, his whole body shaking. He watched as they knelt beside her, as they pressed fingers to her wrist, as they murmured things to each other. He wanted to scream at them to do something. Then one of them turned to him. His lips moved, but Jake didn't hear the words. All he heard was the silence that followed. And then, "I'm so sorry." The world cracked. Jake stumbled back, shaking his head. No, this wasn't real. They were wrong. She was going to wake up. Any second now. He took a step forward, but strong hands held him back. His knees buckled. The room blurred. His gaze landed on the bouquet of white lilies, still lying on the floor beside her. His chest caved in. The flowers weren't a gift anymore. They were a goodbye. Jake didn't know how long he had been sitting there. Everything around him felt distant, like a bad dream where nothing made sense. He could hear voices, people moving, but none of it registered. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. He couldn't look away from her. His mom. She was lying there just like before. But now there was something even worse. Something final in the way she didn't move. In the way her fingers remained still. The way her lips no longer curled into a smile. And then suddenly, hands touched his shoulders. A voice soft but firm. "Jake." "Mrs. Anderson." She knelt beside him, her eyes filled with something he didn't want to see. Pity. "She's just tired, right?" His own voice didn't sound like his. It was too quiet, too shaky. Mrs. Anderson swallowed hard. She didn't answer. And that silence shattered everything. Because silence meant the truth. And the truth was unbearable. No. The word barely left his lips. His hands curled into fists. No, this wasn't happening. She was going to wake up. She had to wake up. Because if she didn't... His chest tightened. His breath came out in quick, shallow gasps. He tried to hold on to something, anything. But the only thing his fingers found was cold. Cold skin. Cold air. Cold reality. And then all at once the world collapsed. People came and went. They asked him questions, spoke in hushed tones, but he barely heard them. The only thing that mattered was that they took her away. They took her, and he couldn't stop them. He just sat there, unmoving, staring at the empty space where she had been. And when the house finally fell silent again, he realized he was alone. Completely, utterly, alone. That night, Jake didn't sleep. He sat on the floor by the window, staring out into the empty street. Outside, life continued. People walked by. Cars passed. Lights in the houses across the road flickered on and off. As if nothing had happened. As if the world hadn't just crumbled. He dug his nails into his palms, squeezing his hands into fists so tight they ached. How could everything just go on? How could people keep living when his mom was gone? The next morning, someone knocked on the door. He didn't move. The knocking came again, followed by a familiar voice. "Jake?" "Mrs. Anderson." She wasn't going to leave. With a heavy sigh, he stood up and walked to the door, opening it just enough to see her face. "Sweetheart, have you eaten today?" He didn't answer. She frowned, then glanced past him into the house. "Can I come in?" He hesitated. Then, without a word, he stepped aside. She walked in looking around. The house was exactly as it had been the day before. Exactly as it had been when his mom was still there. Mrs. Anderson let out a small sigh and turned to him. "I made you some soup." She placed a small container on the counter. Jake stared at it. He wasn't hungry. He wasn't anything. He was just there. Mrs. Anderson softened her voice. "Jake, I know it feels like everything has stopped. But you need to take care of yourself." He swallowed hard, staring at the floor. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone, sweetheart. I'm right here." He wanted to believe that. But how could he not feel alone when the only person who had ever truly been there for him was gone? By the afternoon, the funeral had been arranged. He didn't know who planned it. People made decisions around him for him about him. They told him where to go, what time to be there. But none of it made sense. How could you plan something like this? How could you just pick a time and a place and say, "This is when we say goodbye"? Because he wasn't ready. He would never be ready. But no one asked. Time moved forward, dragging him with it, whether he wanted it to or not. The next day, he stood at the cemetery, dressed in the only nice clothes he owned. People gathered around, faces he barely recognized. Some hugged him. Some whispered words of comfort. He didn't react. His eyes were locked on one thing. The coffin. The wooden box that held the only person who had ever loved him the way she did. The weight of it hit him all at once. This was it. This was goodbye. His throat closed up. He wanted to scream. To reach out. To stop it. But his feet wouldn't move. And then, the coffin was lowered. People tossed dirt onto it. One by one, they said their final words. Jake stood there frozen. He wanted to say something too. But what words could possibly be enough? What could he say that would make any of this real? Instead, he reached into his bag, pulled out the white lilies he had bought just for her. The ones she never got to see. With shaking hands, he stepped forward, kneeled beside the fresh earth, and gently placed the bouquet down. His voice was barely above a whisper. "This is for you, Mom." A tear slipped down his cheek, landing on the petals. "I worked so hard. I just wanted to make you happy." The wind stirred around him, rustling the flowers. Jake bit his lip, squeezing his eyes shut. He had thought this moment would break him, that he wouldn't be able to handle it. But as he sat there, staring at the lilies resting on her grave, he realized he wasn't saying goodbye, because she would never really be gone. Not as long as he remembered her. Not as long as he kept her with him. And as the wind carried the scent of lilies through the air, he thought, just for a second, that maybe she was still here. Somewhere. Watching over him. The house no longer felt like home. It was just walls. Just furniture. Just a hollow, empty space where life used to exist. It still smelled like her. Faint traces of her perfume lingered in the air. The scent of her favorite tea still clung to the kitchen. But day by day it faded, and that terrified Jake. Because when the scent was gone, what would be left? He hadn't left the house since the funeral. Day and night blurred together. He stayed in his room most of the time, lying awake, staring at the ceiling. Sometimes, he thought he heard her footsteps outside his door. Sometimes, he swore he heard her voice in the quiet of the night. But every time he opened his eyes, nothing. Just silence. And silence had never felt so loud. One morning, hunger forced him out of bed. He hadn't eaten in, he wasn't sure how long. His stomach felt empty, but the thought of food made him sick. Still, he wandered into the kitchen, opened the fridge. Bare shelves. A half-empty bottle of water. A jar of peanut butter. A single can of soup. He stared at it for a long time, but he didn't take anything. Instead, he shut the fridge and turned away. He wasn't hungry. Not really. Not for food. A knock at the door made him flinch. He knew who it was before he even got up. Mrs. Anderson had been coming by every day, checking on him. He didn't know why she kept trying. He wasn't worth checking on. But still, he opened the door. She stood there with a warm smile, holding a plate covered in foil. "Hey, sweetheart. I made you some pie." Jake hesitated. He didn't want pie. He didn't want anything. But her eyes were kind, and her voice was soft, and he didn't have the energy to say no. So he stepped aside, letting her in. She walked into the kitchen like she belonged there, like she had done this 1,000 times. She placed the pie on the table and glanced around, taking in the dishes in the sink, the unopened food on the counter. Jake sat down, staring at the table. "You haven't been eating much, have you?" she asked gently. He shrugged. "Jake." Her voice was softer now, almost careful. "I know it feels like everything has stopped. Like the world shouldn't keep going without her." His fingers curled into his sleeves. Because she was right. Nothing made sense without his mom. "But you can't let yourself disappear with her, sweetheart." Jake's throat tightened. "I'm not disappearing. Aren't you?" She gestured toward the untouched food. The dark circles under his eyes. The way his shoulders hunched like he was trying to make himself smaller. "She wouldn't want this for you." Her words stung. He knew she meant well. But she didn't understand. Nobody did. "I don't want to forget her," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Anderson softened. "Jake, remembering her doesn't mean you have to stop living." That's where she was wrong. Because if he moved on, if he let himself smile, if he let himself eat and sleep, and feel something other than this aching emptiness, wouldn't that mean she was really gone? That night, he sat by the window, knees pulled to his chest. Outside, the world moved on. People walked down the street. Cars passed, lights flickered on in houses. The world didn't stop for his grief. It just kept turning, leaving him behind. He swallowed hard, looking at the stars. "Mom, what am I supposed to do?" The silence gave him no answers. Just the quiet hum of the night. Just the distant sound of life continuing. Just the emptiness in his chest. The next afternoon, his uncle showed up. Jake had barely thought about him since the funeral. They weren't close. His mom rarely talked about him, and Jake barely remembered the last time they'd spoken. But now here he was, standing on the porch, waiting. Jake stared at him for a long moment before finally opening the door. His uncle gave him a small nod. "Hey kid." Jake didn't answer. "Can I come in?" Without a word, Jake stepped aside. His uncle walked into the kitchen and sat down at the table, hands clasped in front of him. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then finally, "You know why I'm here, right?" Jake stiffened. He didn't want to hear it. "Not now. Not ever." "You can't stay here alone," his uncle said gently. Jake's stomach twisted. "I don't want to leave." His uncle sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. "I know, kid, but this house, it's just walls. It's not her." Jake's jaw tightened. "I know that. Do you?" His uncle leaned forward. "Because I think you're afraid that if you leave, you'll lose her completely." Jake's chest ached. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his palms. "If I go, she's gone." The words cracked as they left his mouth. His uncle's eyes softened. "Jake, she's already gone." Jake's breath hitched. His uncle sighed, rubbing his temples before continuing. "But she's not gone from you." Jake shook his head, staring down at his lap. "I don't want to forget her." "Then don't." His uncle's voice was firm but not harsh. "But don't let your grief be the only thing left of her." Jake squeezed his eyes shut. "I don't know how to do that." His uncle sighed. "Then start by just living." The words lingered in the air. Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of them. Living sounded so simple. But how could he do that when everything inside him felt so broken? That night, he went to his mother's closet. For the first time in weeks, he pulled open the door and reached for her coat. He pressed his face into the fabric, breathing in the scent that was almost gone. Tears stung his eyes, but this time they didn't fall. Because for the first time he understood something. She wasn't in this house. She wasn't in the things she left behind. She was in the way he remembered her. In the way she loved him. In the way he loved her. That's where she would always be. No matter what. The house still smelled like her. Not as strongly as before, but faint traces lingered. The scent of her perfume in the hallway. The faded smell of her favorite tea in the kitchen. But Jake knew it wouldn't last forever. Every day the smell faded. And that terrified him. Because when the scent was gone, what else would be left? Jake woke up late. Or maybe he didn't wake up at all. Maybe he had just drifted in and out of the same half-conscious haze he'd been trapped in since the funeral. Lying in bed, he stared at the ceiling. His body felt heavy. His mind felt blank. Another day. Another morning without her. Eventually, he forced himself up. His stomach growled, but he ignored it. He had stopped feeling hunger the way he used to. Food was just another part of life that had lost its meaning. Still, he walked into the kitchen and opened the fridge. Mostly empty. A bottle of water. A carton of milk that was probably expired. A couple of things people had brought over that he never touched. He closed the fridge. Not hungry. Not for food. Not for anything. A knock at the door. He didn't move. Then another. A voice followed. "Jake? It's me. Mrs. Anderson." She had been checking on him almost every day. Sometimes he ignored her. Sometimes he let her in just so she wouldn't worry. Today he sighed and walked to the door, opening it. She gave him a soft smile. "Hey, sweetheart." She was holding a covered dish. "I made you some pie. Thought you might like it." Jake hesitated, then stepped aside, letting her in. She moved through the house with a quiet familiarity, setting the pie on the table before glancing around. Her eyes flickered to the sink where dishes were stacked, to the fridge still mostly empty, to Jake. "Have you been eating?" Jake shrugged. Mrs. Anderson sighed. She pulled out a chair, sat down across from him. "Jake, you can't keep doing this to yourself." His jaw tightened. "Doing what?" "Pretending that if you don't move forward, nothing has changed." Jake looked down. She reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "I know it hurts. And I know you think that if you move on, you'll lose her completely." His throat tightened. "I don't want to forget her." "Then don't." Her voice was steady. "But don't let your grief be the only thing left of her." Jake swallowed hard. Because deep down he knew she was right. But how could he move forward when it felt like leaving his mom behind? That evening he sat by the window staring at the world outside. People passed by. They laughed. Talked. Lived. The world kept moving. And he was stuck. He heard a car pull up outside. Jake's stomach twisted. He knew who it was before he even saw him. His uncle. The knock was firm. Jake hesitated, then opened the door. His uncle looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Hey kid." Jake didn't respond. "Can I come in?" After a pause he stepped aside. His uncle walked in, glanced around. He didn't say anything about the state of the house, or about the untouched pie still sitting on the table. Instead he just sat down. "You know why I'm here." Jake clenched his jaw. He didn't want to have this conversation. Not again. "You can't stay here alone, Jake." Silence. "You need someone to take care of you." "I can take care of myself." His uncle sighed. "That's not the point." Jake's hands curled into fists. "I don't want to leave." "Why?" Jake's breath caught. He knew why. But saying it out loud made it real. "Because if I leave, she's gone." His voice cracked on the last word. His uncle leaned forward, his expression softer than before. "Jake, she's already gone." Jake flinched. But his uncle wasn't done. "Leaving this house doesn't mean leaving her." Jake shook his head, looking away. "You don't understand." "Ido." His uncle exhaled slowly. "I know it feels like this house is all you have left of her. But she's not in these walls." Jake's chest ached. His uncle's voice softened even more. "She's in you." Jake looked up, his throat tight. "I don't know how to do this without her." "You don't have to figure it all out at once. Just take it one day at a time." Jake stared down at the table, feeling the weight of those words. That night, he went to his mother's closet. He hadn't opened it since she died. Slowly, he reached inside and pulled out her coat. It was soft. Familiar. He buried his face in the fabric, inhaling. The scent was barely there now. Fading. Disappearing. Tears welled in his eyes. "Mom!" The silence was deafening. But this time it didn't crush him. Because for the first time he understood something. She wasn't in this house. She wasn't in her things. She was in the love she had given him, in the memories she left behind, in him. And that meant she was never truly gone. The house didn't feel as cold anymore. The pain was still there, but it wasn't suffocating. It hadn't disappeared, but it had changed, become something quieter, something that no longer clawed at his chest with every breath. Jake still noticed the things his mother left behind: the mug on the kitchen counter, the book on the nightstand, the coat hanging by the door. But now they didn't just remind him of what he had lost. They reminded him of her. And that was different. He opened the closet where her coat still hung. For days, he had been afraid to touch it, terrified that if he did, it would lose her scent completely. Now he reached out and ran his fingers over the fabric. He didn't breathe it in. He didn't cling to it. He just stood there, remembering the way she used to wear it, how she would pull it tight around herself when it was cold, laughing about how she should really get a new one but never did. He carefully folded the coat and placed it back inside. Not because he was letting go, but because he didn't need to hold on to it so tightly anymore. The day passed differently than before. For the first time in weeks, he ate something without feeling like it was just an obligation. For the first time he noticed the world outside. The sounds of cars driving by, the voices of neighbors talking, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Life was still happening. And for the first time he let himself think that maybe he could be part of it again. When his uncle arrived that evening, Jake wasn't afraid. They sat at the kitchen table sipping tea in silence. Then Jake spoke first. "I'm not leaving." His uncle nodded, as if he already knew what Jake was going to say. "But I'm going to try." The man studied him for a long moment before giving a small smile. For the first time, Jake felt like he had made the right choice. Later that day, he left the house on his own. Not because he had to. Not because someone told him to. Just because he wanted to. His feet carried him down the familiar streets. Past the corner store. Past the playground. And finally to the park. The same park where his mother used to take him. The same park where she used to sit on a bench, watching him play. Jake sat down on that bench. He ran his hand along the wooden surface, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. And for the first time in weeks, he didn't cry. He just closed his eyes and remembered her laughter. Remembered the way she looked at him, full of warmth and love. She was still here. Not in a way he could touch. Not in a way he could see. But in a way that mattered. When he got home, he walked into his mother's room. For the first time since she died, everything was exactly how she had left it. The blanket on her bed. The book she had been reading. And on the nightstand, a photograph of them together. Jake picked it up carefully. It was old, slightly faded. But the moment it captured was clear. His mom smiling, her arm wrapped around him. It was the way he wanted to remember her. Not sick. Not in pain. Not lying on the floor unmoving. But alive. With love in her eyes. With happiness in her smile. That was who she was. That was who she would always be. He placed the photo on the kitchen table, where he could see it every day. Because now he knew. He didn't have to hold on to grief to keep her close. She wasn't in the past. She was in him. And she always would be. The house no longer felt like a graveyard. It still carried memories, but they didn't weigh him down the way they used to. Jake had spent weeks drowning in grief, afraid that if he let go of the pain, he would be letting go of her. But now he understood something. His mother wasn't in the sadness. She was in the love she had left behind. That morning, he opened the closet where her coat still hung. He ran his fingers over the fabric. But this time, he didn't hold on to it like a lifeline. He didn't need to. Instead, he took it down carefully, folded it, and placed it inside a wooden box on the shelf. Not to forget. Not to bury her memory. But because he didn't have to cling to her things anymore to feel close to her. She wasn't in a coat. She was in him. The day felt different. For the first time in a long time, he had an appetite. He made himself breakfast. Nothing fancy, just toast and eggs. But as he stood at the stove, flipping the eggs the way his mom used to, he realized something. It felt normal. Not happy. Not completely okay. But normal. And that was enough. For now. That afternoon his uncle came over. Jake didn't dread it like before. They sat at the kitchen table, sipping tea, neither in a hurry to speak. But this time, it was Jake who broke the silence first. "I'm staying." His uncle nodded, as if he had expected that answer. "I know." Jake studied him carefully. "You're not going to try to convince me otherwise?" His uncle shook his head. "Not anymore. Because I can see it now." "See what?" The man smiled slightly. "That you're finally living again." Jake exhaled, a quiet relief washing over him. Because it was true. He was still grieving. He always would be. But he wasn't stuck anymore. And that was enough. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Jake left the house simply because he wanted to. Not because he had to. Not because someone told him to. But because he chose to. His feet led him through the neighborhood, past the places that once felt too painful to visit, past the corner store, past the schoolyard, and finally to the park. The place where his mother used to take him. The place where she would sit on the bench, watching him play. He sat down on that same bench, ran his fingers over the wooden surface, closed his eyes, and instead of grief, he felt her presence. Not in a ghostly way, not in some magical otherworldly sense, but in the warmth of the evening air, in the sound of rustling leaves, in the love she had left behind. When he returned home, he did something he had been too afraid to do since she died. He walked into her room. The air smelled faintly like her. Everything was still in place. The blanket on the bed, the book she had been reading, the mug on her nightstand, and next to it, an old photograph. He picked it up. It was one of them together. His mother, arms wrapped around him, smiling the way she always did. He traced the image with his fingers. Then carefully, he carried the photo out of her room and placed it on the kitchen table, where he could see it every day. Because now he understood. Moving forward didn't mean leaving her behind. She wasn't in the past. She was in him. And she always would be. The house was quiet. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence it had been before. It was peaceful now. Jake sat at the kitchen table, staring at the framed photo of his mother. She was smiling in the picture, just like she always had. For the first time, looking at it didn't make him feel like breaking. It made him feel warm. She wasn't gone. Not really. Not as long as he carried her with him. He left the house that morning without hesitation. The cold air hit his skin, but it didn't make him shiver. It woke him up. For the first time in weeks he felt alive. Not just surviving. Not just existing. Living. He walked through the neighborhood, noticing things he had ignored for so long. The rustling of leaves. The scent of fresh coffee from the cafe down the street. The laughter of kids playing in the distance. Everything kept moving, and he was finally moving with it. He knew exactly where he was going. By the time he reached the cemetery, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in soft shades of orange and pink. He walked slowly through the rows of gravestones until he reached hers. Her name was carved into the stone, simple and clean. Jake stood there for a long moment just looking. Then, he pulled a bouquet of white lilies from the bag he had brought. The same flowers he had worked so hard to buy for her birthday. The ones she never got to see. With careful hands, he placed them on the grave. Then he knelt down, tracing his fingers over her name. "Hi, Mom." His voice was quiet, steady. "I thought coming here would be harder. But it's not." He exhaled slowly, feeling the cool evening air fill his lungs. "I think it's because I know you're not really here." He smiled just a little. "You're with me." A soft breeze swept past him, rustling the petals of the lilies. For a brief second, it almost felt like an answer. Jake closed his eyes. For the first time since she left, he didn't feel lost. He felt found. Because she had never truly left him. And she never would. Subscribe to the channel, and hit the like button, so you don't miss more heartwarming stories.